Those same churches, if you ask them, should a physician be able to have consensual sexual contact with their patient, they would probably say, oh my goodness, absolutely not. Should a psychologist be able to have consensual sexual contact with their patient? Absolutely not. And none of those would be looked at as an affair. But when it comes to spiritual leaders, there seems to be a double standard.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Ekemini Uwan, Ashley Hales, and I discuss President Biden's new asylum order and its ramifications for action at the southern border. Next, more millennials and Gen Zers are choosing to live together in community. Might this be an antidote for our epidemic of loneliness? Finally, is it an affair or abuse? We discuss whether clergy sexual misconduct with parishioners should be criminalized. Special guests Bree Stensrud, John Shelton, and Boz Chavitin join the conversation. Welcome to the show. This week, we've got a special treat for you listeners. Joining me at the microphones are two women who think deeply on issues of community and justice, Ekemini Uwan and Ashley Hales. Ekemini is a public theologian, international human rights activist, and the co-host of the award-winning podcast Truth's Table and Get in the Word with Truth's Table. Ashley Hales is co-founder of the Willowbrae Institute and author of several books. She produces the Russell Moore Show here at CT Media. Ladies, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks. To be here.
So last week, President Biden issued a new executive order related to immigration, and it is a controversial one. This order turns away those who are seeking asylum by crossing the southern border between legal points of entry. When the number of these illegal crossings exceeds a 7-day average of 2,500, the order goes into effect. While senior officials say this is a response to the bipartisan immigration bill that has languished in the Senate, critics are concerned that it looks a lot like heavy-handed Republican immigration policy. Some pundits are saying that this move comes as Biden is struggling to keep a lead in the polls. Back in March, when the number of border crossings was soaring, we invited Bree Stensrud, director of Women of Welcome, to join us here on the show. If you missed it, definitely check out episode 72 to hear her boots-on-the-ground perspective. And today, we wanted to invite her back to help us understand President Biden's intentions and how this new order fits into broader immigration policy and action. Bree, welcome back to the Bulletin.
Thank you for having me again.
So it's been 3 months since you last joined us, and I imagine a whole lot has happened at the southern border. Tell us what you have noticed since this new asylum order went into effect in the last week or so.
Well, I think year over year, the data tells us that we see a decline in encounters at the border, and you can attribute that to so many factors, one of which is the Mexican government really rounding up and holding and looking for migrants passing through Mexico. And there are story after story of vulnerable migrants being held in southern parts of Mexico in order to try and appease the U.S. government and the pressure that the U.S. government has been putting on Mexico to try and really curb the flow that is coming up from Central and South America. So we're not seeing positivity in what is happening along the way. What we are seeing is there are more deterrent measures that are being put in place south of the southern border that are affecting the numbers. This particular new executive action is something that bypasses public comment, that bypasses all of the usual points of feedback that the public or organizations and immigrant rights advocacy groups can actually give to the administration before something is implemented. I think the first question that everybody is wanting to know is this going to be upheld in court? Because it's actually, according to the precedent that was sent by the Supreme Court in 2018, when the Trump administration did a very similar action, is that this did not hold up in court. So first of all, is this legal according to our law? And according to Section 208 of the Immigration Nationality Act, this is not lawful to do. So what I would say is what we are seeing is we're seeing a decline in encounters, but that's not necessarily a positive thing. That's not because we have great solutions working in Congress to actually form a more humane and orderly process. We are seeing just kind of this convergence of confusion and deterrent measures that are pushing very vulnerable people back into very dangerous and destructive situations.
Who is the average person who is crossing between legal ports of entry? Is this an unaccompanied minor? Is this a mom with a child? Are these complete families?
During the warmer months, you're seeing an increase in family units that are showing up, but you're seeing all of the above. You have individuals who are coming for various reasons. You have lots of fathers who are coming by themselves to kind of carve out a path for their families before they invite their families to make that dangerous trek. You have families who've experienced such immense violence and desperation that they are coming on their own with their children through the Darien Gap or through the territories of Mexico. It's just extremely dangerous. They are extremely vulnerable. So you're seeing all of the above. This new executive action actually is kind of this really horrific repeat of 2018, in which we are providing a very perverse incentive in order to approach the border. Right now, we're not treating families the same as children. And so you can send your child to the border and we will not turn your child away because of the TVPRA legislation that we have in place. But families cannot approach themselves. I've seen this on Border Patrol footage when I've been down to the border, is that you see families who are waiting in the brush and they know they can't present themselves. So then they will attach a phone number to their child's chest and they will send their child up to the border to find an agent. And so this is covert family separation all over again. This is providing, like I said, that perverse incentive, that excruciating decision that parents have to say is, I did this so my child can have a better life. And since this isn't an orderly process, but they'll take you instead of all of us, I'm sending you. If Biden can persuade the courts for this to be allowed this time around, it will set a precedent that future administrations can use to further shut down asylum for the rest of the world that continues to come to us. So it's a very scary precedent to think that could continue.
Ashley, you are a Californian and you live in an area of California that depends on migrant workers for a lot of agricultural work. What kind of responses have you heard to this new order? Is the buzz good, or do you think this is falling short of people's hopes and expectations where you live?
I am in the central coast of California, so I'm not, as close as some relatives in Orange County and San Diego who, through their church communities, have really sought to help acclimate asylum seekers. I know there are nonprofits like Hope for San Diego that works with refugees and World Relief. I think, unfortunately, most of us who find ourselves in middle-class America, especially in California, we don't see where our food is picked. We don't see those day laborers. When we don't see the situation, we can easily ignore it because it's not right in our faces and on our doorsteps. And so though the church has been influential and many organizations have really stepped into the gap, unfortunately, I think we kind of know that it's there, but we turn a blind eye.
Pew Research found that 1 in 5 Black people in the United States are immigrants or children of immigrants, with more than half of these immigrants having arrived in the last 20 years. Ekemini, what has been the response to this new executive order in the Black community?
I was just on Capitol Hill just a couple of days ago when this news was coming forth, and it was not received positively within our community. I was just with some Black immigrant activists in human rights groups that were talking about this, because oftentimes in these conversations, which I appreciate that you all are bringing this nuance into the conversation, that oftentimes Black immigrants are left out of the conversation, and it's not fully appreciated the rainbow of migrants that are actually trying to come in to the country, including Chinese migrants, right, coming in. And so it has not been received positively, considering the fact that we are often detained, deported at higher rates. And so there's some great concern about what the future might look like for Black immigrants and also just the makeup of the Black community. We know something has to be done. I mean, it's not as if people are saying nothing should be done at all, but is there another way?
I understand that asylum laws and the asylum process right now is messy and it seems really kind of disorderly, and that there's no cap and we can't take everybody that's coming. But if the law should change about asylum, then Congress should do it. It should not be done and bypassed by the American people and by our representatives by some executive order. It wasn't even put up for public comment. It was implemented overnight. And this is not a compassionate approach. This is not going to create more humane orderly ways of process at the border. So the concept that that people think that they have to choose between safe and secure borders and humane treatment of people is such a false narrative. They are not mutually exclusive concepts to say that we have enough creativity and ideation and smart people in this country that can accomplish both at the same time. Safe and secure borders, which not only is for American citizens, but it is also for people on the other side of the border. If we didn't have safe and secure borders, then we would not be a place to seek asylum. We would not be a place of safety and protection. So I don't say that because I just want to keep only Americans safe and secure. I'm saying that because that provides safety and security for vulnerable people who are showing up and do need protection. So safe and secure borders, absolutely, but also humane treatment of people. And what this executive action now does is it pushes people into further desperation. So already desperate people are going to be now fueling, as if it wasn't already a big business, fueling the cartels on the south side of the border. So instead of the American people and instead of our US government deciding who stays and who goes and who we can actually benefit from, and I mean that in the most humane way possible, and the fact that this is an opportunity not only for Christians in a missional mindset, but it is an opportunity for Americans and our economy that desperately needs workers, right? I'm saying that instead of the American government deciding who can come and who can go and Christians being able to missionally respond to this, we are letting the cartels overrun and actually exploit the very people that we say we need a robust system for.
Poll after poll tells us that Americans support mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. A brand new Pew Research study that was just released last week said that 6 in 10 Trump supporters favor a national effort to deport undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. A CNN poll back from January said that half of Americans said that they would support mass deportations. What do you think fuels these desires for the American people?
I think, unfortunately, our politics have become so tribal, especially in the last decade. Tobias Kramer wrote a book called The Godless Crusade, where he talks about the co-option of Christian symbolism by these populist nationalistic movements. And unfortunately, we're seeing that not only around the world, but also in America, that we've created this kind of soup of what it means to be a Christian. And it usually looks like white only, that we kind of use the symbols of Christianity for political gain. And so I think there is, unfortunately, this kind of populist strand within the Republican Party particularly, and within the white church in America, that is choosing to understand itself as us versus them. And so what you get by that is if we can get any of those them away from the us, then we'll somehow create this pure, morally upright nation. Unfortunately, I would say that the mass deportation idea, I think, is a way to not understand community, to not understand really the benefits of America, and to not actually understand that really we can have both diversity and unity to the best of all of our citizens, that being an actual pluralistic unity is going to actually help all of us.
So when we think about this community of the church, it's so polarized right now. And even with this executive order, we're seeing fingers pointed. Those who don't like Biden say that this is a co-opted kind of political maneuver. Those who like Trump say that he's trying to steal from the playbook. And in the midst of this, the voice of the church needs to rise. So ladies, what is the voice of the church here? Is it corrective? Is it prophetic? Is it lament? How can we have conversations, perhaps not on a grand scale because we have limited political responsibility and recourse, but with our neighbors, in our small groups, with folks who may have very differing views on immigration and how all of this should play out?
We need collective courage, and we need that from the pulpit. Immigration is not simply a political issue. It is deeply rooted in the Bible. The Bible has nothing to say about U.S. immigration policy. It does not prescribe how we are to move forward. What it does say is a lot about immigrants and refugees and God's heart for the vulnerable among us and those who are marginalized. So we need collective courage and theological depth from our leaders in our pulpits. The love of Jesus and the flourishing of his image bearers is not a convenient way forward, but it is the way forward. And if we want to be like Christ, we are going to have to show welcome like Christ. We are going to have to be convictionally showing up in ways that change culture, not assimilate with it. And this is the challenge that I would say the church has to respond to. Otherwise, we continue to become irrelevant in our culture.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the passage from Matthew 25:40, and Jesus says, "What you did for the least of these, you did for me." If somebody is coming to the United States of America from their homeland and they're black and brown, you have to know that they are in a state of desperation to do that.
This conversation is just so helpful in modeling for us the kind of discourse that we need to commit to having around these hot button topics like immigration in our small groups, in our families, and in the church, especially as this election season progresses. Thank you so much, Bree, for joining us. It's been a great conversation. We will be right back. Back in January, a survey from the online lending marketplace LendingTree found that more than 60% of millennials and Gen Z are choosing to live near family and friends. In particular, they're prioritizing those connections when they choose to buy homes. Some are even choosing to buy those homes in partnership with others. This past week, author Elizabeth Oldfield wrote a piece for the Times of London about her own experience of purchasing a home with friends. She and her husband and their 2 kids found that they were being priced out of the London real estate market, so they shopped around for another couple who would be willing to live communally with them. This story and all of the data about moving and purchasing habits of young Americans is really fascinating, especially as we overlay it with the very sobering data that we have about loneliness in America. If, as reports tell us, 1 in 3 Americans is lonely every week, is it time for us to consider moving in together? Joining us for this conversation is John Shelton. John is the policy director for Advancing American Freedom, and he lived for more than a decade in intentional communities. John, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks for having me on.
So, John, I want to jump right in and ask you the question that I suspect we're all asking. What is it actually like to live in an intentional community in such proximity with other people?
It is wonderful and terrible at the same time. There's a Dorothy Day quote, I think, that everyone wants a revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes. And more often than not, living together in an intentional community is arguments about who's going to be leading the revolution and who stays back and does the dishes. So it's really high highs and very low lows. So there's a lot of difficulties to navigate. In what way are we going to be intentional? Who's on board for it? Are there people begrudgingly dragging their feet? And what role do the people who want to be more intentional in the intentional community have in setting the pace, setting the tone for other people without being self-righteous?
Let's step back a little bit in history, Ashley, because what John is describing is actually nothing new, right? Could you give us a little bit of a sense of what the history is of Christian intentional community and what the intentional is and what the community is that we're talking about here?
You think way back in Acts chapter 4, the church had all things in common, right? They had a common purse. They were caring for the poor. There was a sense in which even the word Christian came out of the reality that we don't know how to classify these people, right? Because they care for the poor and they're actually crossing so many boundaries, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's racial or ethnic. And the Christians are this cross-cultural community who live radically different lives. We see it kind of grow throughout, especially the patristic period in the 4th century. We get the monastic movement. Most famous, of course, is Saint Benedict and the Benedictine monks. And then you get, the Reformation period. And of course, this is such a broad brushstroke, but, get Luther, who's saying, actually, it's not those priests way off there. It's the priesthood of all believers. But we get the Anabaptist tradition, and that shows up on American shores, where we get both kind of Christian and secular communal living experiments. You get the Amish, you get the Bruderhof, and we get, all the way up until early 2000s, Shane Claiborne really kind of pioneered the new monastic movement that we see, of course, splintering still today. So all of these, though, are efforts to actually take, I think, the gospel seriously, to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously, and to say that being a Christian is not simply like tick boxes of doctrine, but it's actually a way of life.
Western culture largely focuses on the nuclear family as the center of society, but clearly what you're describing, even Ashley, isn't the case for other cultures. Kemeny, I wonder how might the practices of other cultures inform our understanding of what it means to live in community like this?
From other cultures, there is a much more expansive understanding of family. And I think about intergenerational homes. Me being first gen Nigerian American, I grew up in an intergenerational home. My grandmother came to the US in maybe about 89. And she came and lived with us many, many years, trying to help my mom. And my father was sick and disabled at that time. And so I can't imagine where our family would be had she not come. And then we've had, other family members that had to stay with us from, time to time, aunts and uncles, and vice versa, me staying with my sister and her nieces. And so there is just a more expansive understanding of family that I actually think is much more akin to what the Bible puts forth and casts forth a vision for us when we think about Jesus on the cross and him saying to his mother, Mary, woman, behold your son, right? To John, and to him, behold your mother, and so even when we think about that, we can see the ways in which Jesus is showing us the multitudinous ways that family can be formed. And I hope that we begin to embrace that much more.
What you're just describing is really helpful because it diagnoses that not only is this not Christian, but in a way, this isn't even really that Western. You have Henry VIII dissolves the monasteries, and at the time he does that, 1 in 50 people are living in these kinds of communities. And so this is an extremely prevalent way of doing life in the West up until we get into this weird modern moment. And now we're sort of just inventing it piecemeal afterwards, trying to recreate. I mean, it's called new monasticism for a reason, because it's trying to replace what was lost. And there were reasons for the reforms that closed the monasteries. They weren't serving the church. They were very secular, and they were sitting on a lot of money. There's legitimate problems there, but something serious was lost. And I think this conversation is getting at, we need to recover that. And we're feeling that. Secular people, Christian people, everyone is feeling the existential loneliness.
In her piece, Oldfield describes intentional community as a counterweight to this idea, because I'm worth it, follow your bliss, how dare you ask me to care, that kind of messaging that is so present. Do you think that is really a compelling alternative that is driving folks to intentional community, or is there something deeper?
Well, I mean, I would imagine that there's multiple factors, right? There's the economic reality of how difficult it is for single adults. I just think that because of the ways in which our economy has shifted, it has been shaped in the ways in which gas prices, food prices, home prices, rent, and then not to mention that the housing crisis. I do think that in some ways there's some inevitability there. I think there are some people that are really betwixt and between, but it's a contentious choice. It's a hard choice. And I think an economic factor, we can't exclude that. Of course, the sociological factors of loneliness and an impact of loneliness psychologically too. What does it mean to be able to be in a house full of other people? Although it has its its disadvantages, as John has laid out, but to hear the pitter patter of feet in the home, or the pitter patter of paws if you're a dog person, to know that there is somebody else in this house with me. Somebody will sit and watch this movie with me. Mm-hmm. Or I can have somebody that will, take a walk with me. That means a lot to people, particularly if you are uncoupled, if you're single. That makes a world of a difference.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And there's this weird trade-off between the more wealth that we have, the more able to be alone we are. Even if we don't want to be alone, we're choosing loneliness. It's like if you've read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, his picture of hell, his dystopia, is us all living in the suburbs and moving further and further apart. It's great that people can afford the things that they want and need, but we're also performing our own dystopia.
I read something interesting in The Atlantic, and it was talking about how no longer are builders creating apartments and houses with dining rooms. And it was this idea that our physical space is also pressuring us to not gather. And it was so fascinating because there's a sense, right, even for young single people who have the ability to purchase an apartment or to live or rent in an apartment, that eating alone is another factor, even as we consider this epidemic of loneliness, and that we don't have the physical spaces to create intentional community. looks like as far as modern America.
Well, then I wonder, Ashley, to follow up then, do you think that intentional communities can survive in places like the suburbs? Because, you see new developments in the suburbs. They have postage stamp front yards, postage stamp backyards, these new homes that don't have dining rooms. Is this only something for young, hip urbanites who want to get involved in social justice, or can the middle-aged mom and dad or singleton make a go of it in the suburbs in intentional community?
My husband and I, as we were planting a church in Southern California suburbia, found it to be extremely difficult. So there was a sense in which people were happy to come over, or they were happy to attend a party, but to really actually get underneath the surface, when folks were going through a divorce or had lost their home or were actually encountering real suffering, was really, really hard. The suburbs are built to pretend as if there is no problem. We can live in our little air-conditioned car and control that. We can go to work and control what we listen to. We can then come home and enter through our garage door and not actually engage in community. And so I will say it is an uphill battle to create any sort of intentional community, whether that's church or neighborhood, in a suburban context. It's not to say it's impossible. There are practices of hospitality. Kemeny was just talking about, just going on walks. There's ways in which you can notice the people around you. And to see suburban folks as not actually broken is also a very prideful stance as well. Folks in suburbia, though they may hide it better, need the gospel too. So how can you be a good neighbor are questions that we can all consider. How can you welcome people that look different from you, that think different from you, that vote different from you? Those are all questions that we can all ask ourselves wherever we are.
Kemeny, you are our public theologian here on tap today. And so I want to know, Emma Camp, she wrote this article in America Magazine recently, and she said, it's worth committing to a church community even if you don't believe in God. Like, there's something as far as community goes that you literally can't replicate anywhere else. What for Emma do you think is so attractive about church that she would be willing to show up, warts and all, to this place for belonging?
Because all human beings are made in the image of God, they have the sense of divinity within them. It's not as salvific, in that way, but there is a sense of deep calling into deep. Right? When you're going into the church house, right? The Holy Spirit is there. God is present among the saints and among not yet believers who have come into the house of the Lord. I think the community and reality that comes as a part of the gathering of fellow believers is a work of the Spirit. You cannot reduplicate it. No matter how many Facebook groups you join, no matter how many mighty network groups you join, it is really difficult to replicate something that is Holy Spirit wrought. And so I'm not surprised by that. I am encouraged by that. I'm really glad to hear that. And my hope and my prayer is that more what I call not yet believers would be able to see that and go into the church, and that one day they would come into contact that would be salvific with our Lord and Savior. But I do think it speaks to the fact that all the flaws that the church has, that the fact that she's able to still sense like, no, there's something different that's happening here that's not happening during my brunch gatherings of my friends. That's not happening at the coffee shop. It's not happening in my co-op spaces. It's not happening during my FaceTimes and whatever. She's noticing that the Spirit is on the move. And that to me is always a good indication. There's more in store maybe for her and for others that are not yet in community in those ways.
If someone is listening in and they say, oh, this sounds really appealing to me, but I can't move or I don't want to move, how do I take the first steps toward this kind of life together, to borrow that phrase from Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
I think as Americans, we can be so transient and we're transactional in our relationships. So thinking about staying put as a spiritual discipline, whether that's in your local church community, in your house, in your neighborhood, to say that these are actually my neighbors right in front of me. Knock on doors and be those obnoxious neighbors and say, hey, we don't know you, or reintroducing yourself. Like, we wave, but I don't know who you are. I'm going to reintroduce myself and embrace awkward for the sake of being a good neighbor. And I think the idea of stability in our neighborhoods, in our churches, is one that we desperately need to recover if we're going to actually be able to weather some of the political polarization that we see all over America and stop thinking in tribalistic terms.
In my book, actually, Truth Table, Black Women's Musings on Life, Love, and Liberation, there's a chapter in there where I talk about singleness. It's really actually analyzing really the sociological and systematic impact of the decimation of the Black family within the US and how it's left a disproportionate number of Black women single who desire to be married, and yet they find themselves single, not by choice, but by force, right? And one of my interventions in that book is actually for the church to begin to cultivate and build up communal options, living options for Black women as they age. Because naturally, we are actually, and within our culture, we believe in fictive kinship. You know, we have all types of what we call play aunties and play uncles who are not uncles or aunts by blood, but they've nurtured us, they've cared for us, they've seen us all throughout our years. So they're very much aunts and uncles to us. And then we just have a more of a collectivist mind state. So it's not such a leap for us to go into such a communal covenant, if you will. But I think it's something that we've been caught unawares by the systemic decimation of our families. And so we have to have some sort of intervention on that. I think we do have to embrace the awkward. And I think we have to embrace our own limits and vulnerability and being honest about what our needs are and being honest about the loneliness or the isolation we're feeling, because by and large, based on the data, you're not alone. And there is most likely somebody that would maybe consider wanting to do that, or maybe living close to one another, right? Maybe in the same building. You know, maybe you don't have to be roommates, but living in the same building, living down the same street, trying to build your village, you know, trying to be intentional.
Psalm 86 reminds us that God places the lonely in families, and sometimes those are our families of origin or the families that we create through marriage. Other times, our loneliness may be met in families of our own design, right? Friends who have committed to walk through life together. Always, we hope, listeners, that you will find your deepest family connections in the church, where Jesus, our brother, shows us the very best way to live in community. John, thanks so much for being with us. Don't go away, listeners. Boz Chavidan joins us after the break. We will be right back. For all the joys of living in community with others, we still live in a very broken world. This is revealed no more heartbreakingly than when we observe clergy engaging in sexual misconduct. According to our own CT reporter, Rebecca Hopkins, sex between clergy members and adults they are spiritually guiding is currently only against the law in 13 states. But many advocates want to see this extended to all 50. They are working behind the scenes to introduce state legislation saying that these kinds of relationships, often characterized as affairs, are not consensual but criminal. There are certain Christian voices who have become trusted advisors in these kind of conversations, and Boz Chavidan is one of them. Boz is an experienced litigator who has dedicated his career to empowering survivors of sexual abuse, assault, and harassment to step forward and seek justice against their perpetrators and the institutions legally responsible for their trauma. He is also the founder and former executive director of Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Boz, thanks for joining us on the Bulletin.
Great to be here. Thank you for highlighting such an important topic.
Many churches refer to clergy sexual misconduct that appears to be consensual as an affair. Why do you think they do this?
I think a number of them simply aren't educated as to what this is and the dynamics involved. Those same churches, if you ask them, should a physician be able to have consensual sexual contact with their patient, they would probably say, oh my goodness, absolutely not. Should a psychologist be able to have consensual sexual contact with their patient? Absolutely not. And none of those would be looked at as an affair. But when it comes to spiritual leaders, there seems to be a double standard. And quite frankly, in my experience, as horrible as it is when a physician or a psychologist or even a lawyer engages in sexual contact with a patient or client, the profound and complex damages that are inflicted upon a victim who has been victimized by their spiritual leader is in many ways much more traumatic, because you add that spiritual component to it. For many, it really decimates not only their emotional well-being, but also their faith.
Boz, what does clergy sexual misconduct, how does it begin? What does it generally look like? And then usually what happens after something dissolves or a victim comes forward to share about their experience?
I want to start off by saying, my law practice is focused exclusively on representing victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault. The most common regular calls our office gets is about this topic. It's helped open my eyes to the epidemic that is going on in this country with regard to adult clergy abuse. I get calls from all over the country, mostly from women, and their stories are so much alike. I mean, obviously the impacts are very different, but I often come home and tell my wife, I'm like, these offenders, it's almost like they're reading from the same manual, because I don't care if it's up in Portland, Oregon or Miami, Florida, they're all engaging in this conduct in the same way. They're predators, and sadly, they are good at it. So how does it start? Obviously, this is a generalization, but I'll just give you an example of a case, because this case is very similar to what I see in many of my other cases. Let's just call her Sally. Sally is a member of a small church up in Wisconsin. Sally's mom died a couple years ago. It's been a real difficult time. She's struggling financially with her husband. They have 2 kids. Their marriage is struggling. It's okay, but it's struggling. The church is without a pastor. Suddenly now, the church gets a pastor. Let's just call him Bob. Bob comes in, and man, he is charismatic. People are thrilled, that we finally got a pastor. He's funny. He's personable. He's engaging. He meets Sally at a sort of an introductory meet the pastor type of thing. Very kind, very sweet, nothing out of the ordinary. Over time, Bob invites Sally and her husband to their house for dinner, he and his wife's house for dinner, and they get to know them. And again, Sally and her husband are like, this is wonderful. We finally have a pastor. And then as time goes on, Bob tells Sally, hey, we have a part-time position at the church available, and I know that you guys have been struggling financially. Maybe you should apply for it. And she does. She doesn't get it. She's actually really disappointed. And he says, don't worry, I'm sure we'll have something else. She's disappointed, but she's now, if you think about this, now she, without even knowing, she's really relying on Bob to present this opportunity that he said is going to come in the future to her. Well, sure enough, a few months later, there's a new position open, part-time. Work 2 days a week is going to help you financially. Her husband and her pray about it. Yes. And what a better place to work than at my home church with this wonderful pastor. Here's the first time that Bob is able to interact with Sally apart from her husband. He has now accomplished the second step. The first step is identifying her. The second step is beginning to isolate her. And then the third step is, as they begin this working relationship, he begins to blur the lines between pastor, employer, and friend. For example, she comes in one day, had a hard morning. He can tell that she's had a hard morning. He begins to get her to open up, but what happened in your morning? And she begins to share a little bit. Remember, he's her pastor. She's sharing. He goes, I think you're really struggling. I wonder if maybe once a week we should take a few minutes. I could help you do some pastoral counseling. And she's like, again, an answer to prayer. Wow, this is great. Well, I won't go through the whole story, but that is the beginning phases of this grooming that went on for about a year. He now knows all about her vulnerabilities. He knows about her struggling marriage, her distraughtness over her mother's death. And after he gets all this information, it's sort of the phase of the grooming is information collecting. Once he has that, he then begins to utilize that information as tools in his moving towards sexualizing this relationship. And once he does, over time, she understands that something's wrong. She knows it's wrong, but this is her pastor. It's profoundly confusing, but more than anything else, profoundly shaming. She can't tell anybody. And while he's abusing her, while he's engaging in the sexual contact, Bob says, and this is across the board, they all do this, we are both in this together. You are a part of this as much as I am. What is he doing? He's equalizing it. He's making her responsible for what's going on. In fact, some of these guys will even say, listen, I'm attracted to you. I can't control myself around you. It's up to you to stop me. He's set it up already to put the blame not on himself, but on her. The amount of shame that causes is profound, and that shame results in silence until finally these victims begin to implode emotionally. Their lives begin to implode, and all of this trauma begins to seep out in various ways. Here's the fact. Most women who finally get to the point of saying, I've got to do something and step forward, now you've destroyed this man's career. You've engaged in an affair, and you're destroying this man's ministry. How dare you? Especially, like, let's go back to Bob. Everybody loved Bob. Guess who ended up leaving the church that she had been a part of since childhood? Sally. Because everybody was a little upset that Sally ruined everything that seemed to be going so well. Bob was eventually dismissed, but then Bob went off to do other type of ministry. Who gets restored? The pastor. Usually the victim is without community and oftentimes has left the church altogether.
Boz, I wonder, is legislating the criminalization of sexual misconduct the best way to approach this problem? Are there complexities that we should be aware of as we listen to those who are advocating for this? I think particularly of a person who might say, I'm concerned about government overreach in church community affairs. Like, this is the business of the church to manage. This is not something for the government to legislate. How would you respond to that?
Well, the church isn't doing it. So shame on them. That same person wouldn't say that about child sexual abuse. Where do you draw the line? If it's abusive, we have to define, should it be criminalized? I happen to believe it should be. It is a person utilizing, exploiting their power to engage in sexual contact of another person, the most intimate, the most personable type of contact that exists. And so legislating is one way of doing it. I don't think it's the only way. I think it's a part of doing it. Whether you criminalize it, whether you at least create causes of action that allows people to bring a lawsuit against a church or a pastor for engaging in this conduct. But there's other things to do too. I mean, what can we do to help transform the culture of Christianity in America? Because what you are doing is you're giving one person or a group of people a sense of power in that church. And ultimately, when that power gets unchecked, these individuals come to believe that the rules don't apply to them. So there's a lot of learning that we have to do in the church, but part of it is legislative. I do think that because, the Catholic Church didn't really begin to address child sexual abuse until they were having to write checks for hundreds of millions of dollars, and it began to impact their bank accounts. Sadly, that's not what should have motivated them to change, but that's what did. And the same thing needs to happen when it comes to this particular issue. If churches have to write huge checks or end up having to close their doors because their failure to protect their flock, or if they see a pastor who's getting arrested, that's going to shake people in going, wow, this is a significant issue that we cannot and will not ignore any longer.
What are some practical ways beyond, if someone is not on their elder board or is not a deacon, that they can help to create the kind of community that you're talking about?
One of the first things, if you're just sort of the average congregation member and you're listening to this going, I wonder if our church is even addressing this type of issue. Go ask your pastor or one of your elders or church leaders, what policies and procedures do we have in place when it comes to child protection and also adult protection? See how they respond. If they say, well, we have a child protection policy and well, can I see it? If there's any resistance to those questions that you're asking, that's a red flag. If they say, well, we don't have an adult protection, what do you mean about adult protection? Well, I just listened to this podcast and this is a pretty serious issue. What safeguards do we have in place? How are we educating our congregation? Because part of it is you can have all the policies you want, but until you have educated and equipped the entirety of the congregation on these issues, and you as a leader say, we are 100% in understanding this type of abuse and preventing it, because that equips everybody to have their antennas up. This is what happens oftentimes. Somebody might see an interaction that makes them a little uncomfortable. Let's just say between a youth pastor and a person in the youth group. They convince themselves that, you know what, maybe I'm just seeing something that I shouldn't, it's me. Or they might say something, and if they say something to somebody in leadership and they get shut down, they recoil and they don't ever say it again. We have to create cultures in our churches that we educate, but then we invite our membership to say, listen, if you see something or you have a concern, please make that known and we will receive it well. And the tough part when it comes to adult clergy abuse is sometimes it's the senior pastor. We can say it's different, but the reality is this: in 98% of the churches in this country, the senior pastor rules the roost. The senior pastor is the one who's put in most of the elders on the elder board. The senior pastor is who's hired the staff. So first steps are simply saying, what do we have in place? And if they don't have this in place, then the question is, hey, could our church begin to get educated on this issue of adult clergy abuse, including getting policies and procedures put in place? My hope is that the response will be, I'm sorry, I didn't think about that. And absolutely, do you want to have a seat at the table and helping us do that? And then reaching out to organizations that are on the front lines of understanding these types of issues. The pastor should not become the expert, or leaders of the church should not say, well, we understand this issue, we'll create these policies on our own. No, understand your limitations, work with others to create those policies, but then also invite those same others to come educate your congregation on a regular basis so that protecting not only children but adults becomes part of the very DNA of your church.
Whether you are a victim of abuse or you have suffered the ripple effects of another's wrongdoing in your family, your community, or your church, I hope that this conversation offers you a glimmer of hope that there are those who are laboring faithfully for truth and justice. You are less alone than you might imagine. Just as God cares for the refugee and the immigrant and the lonely, He cares for those who have been wounded and mistreated by others. As advocates continue to fight for justice, know that God fights for you too. We hope this episode finds you better equipped to understand the headlines and talk about them with your friends. See you next time. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.